Hello everybody and welcome to this month's Newcastle Discover, the latest in our Discover series. My name's Lily Moore and I'm the Alumni Engagement Manager here at Newcastle University, and I'll be the host for today's event. And as always, a massive thank you to everyone for joining us today. Today's session will be focusing on protecting cultural heritage during armed conflict with Professor Peter Stone. Places of cultural heritage are frequently damaged or destroyed in armed conflict, and today we'll explore how we can protect them for future generations. We'll discuss how Newcastle University is at the forefront of national and international efforts to protect heritage, both in the event of armed conflict and following environmental disasters, and our plans for the future protection of this fragile resource. Professor Peter Stone is our speaker today, and Peter became the very first UNESCO Chair for Cultural Property Protection and Peace in 2016, an accolade which has reflected his career-long commitment to highlighting the importance of protecting the past. He's also been a specialist advisor to the UK government and is chair of the UK Committee for the Blue Shield. So without any further ado, Peter, I'm going to pass over to you to start the presentation.
Okay. So, well, thank you very much for the invitation to give this presentation, and thank you to all of the audience for tuning in over their lunches. And as it says on the screen, I'm going to be talking about protecting cultural heritage during armed conflict. And just as a warning, we are talking about armed conflict, and there is one slide that I'm going to show you, which is not the nicest of slides, but it reflects the topic that we're talking about. What I'd like to do is just take us back, though, to the end of the Second World War and to think and reflect on the international community's response to having lived through two world wars in the 20th century. And the first one, the First World War, was created effectively because of the failure of royal families across Europe not to fall into war. And at the end of that war, the League of Nations was created to stop war, and very simplistically through political and economic means. That didn't stop the Second World War. And at the end of that Second World War in 1945, the UN was created, the League of Nations disbanded. But the difference between the UN and the League of Nations was that the UN based around humanity's moral and intellectual solidarity. So moving on from just politics and economics, it was moral and intellectual through, and its agency, UNESCO, education, science and culture. And that was critical. But that wasn't the only element of this focusing of thinking around the importance of culture in particular. So in the Nuremberg trials, senior Nazis had been prosecuted for crimes against cultural property, in the language of the time. In the 48 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 27 establishes the right of every human being to their culture and their cultural heritage. Really importantly, in 1948, the Genocide Convention in its original draft had two versions of genocide: barbarism, genocide against people; vandalism, genocide against their culture and their cultural property. In the end, that was forced to a vote, and in the end, the vandalism side, the destruction of their cultural property being genocide, was forced out of the convention by the so-called settler governments, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand to an extent, but supported by old colonial powers like the UK, because they thought that this might be used against them in their treatment of indigenous communities. But then maintaining that dual approach of barbarism and vandalism, the 1954 Hague Convention on the protection, again in the language of the time, of cultural property, what we would today call heritage, in the event of armed conflict, and its two protocols. But the drafters of that 54 convention envisaged a Red Cross for cultural property, which they eventually talked about in the conference as the blue and white shield, as you see down here. And so that whole agenda at the end of the Second World War, having faced 2 world wars and faced the failure to stop them, became really important. But this wasn't new. These ideas had been around for 2,500 years, from Sun Shao in 6th century BC China, through Polybus, von Grotius, von Clausewitz, and Francis Lieber, the gentleman in the middle, all who argued that allowing cultural property to be damaged during conflict was a bad thing for any armed force to do, and even worse if you destroyed it yourselves, because what you were doing essentially, and simplifying 2,500 years of military thinking into a sentence, you were creating the excuse for the next conflict. So nothing new. The earliest iteration of that in a political way is something called the Patent of Muhammad, granted to the Holy See Monastery of Sinai in 625 or thereabouts of the Common Era. And this is a document with Muhammad's hand on the bottom as his indication that it's authentic, protecting all of the Christian sites from any intrusion of Islam into taking them over or destroying them or using them for Islamic sites. So protection of cultural property at a political level from Islam as the first one that I found so far of the iteration of these processes. The first military one I found is 1385. So the Durham so-called ordinances, the rules and regulations for the English army that were just about to invade Scotland. And the penalty for damaging cultural property, not quite called that at that time, but the same issue, was the same for rape, death. So these things are taken seriously all the way through. Doesn't mean, even if they're taken seriously, that they actually work all that well or are there all the time. So most recently with the conflict, the current conflict in Ukraine, Alexandri, the head of exhibitions in Lviv, no one was prepared for a war of this magnitude, so it was improvised. And that's what we have to stop. We have to start thinking about the worst case scenario. So preparation is fundamental, and what we call CPP, cultural property protection, must be a peacetime activity. If it isn't, as with Ukraine, you will not protect cultural property as well as you could do, and you will lose cultural property that would not necessarily have been lost had preparation happened before the conflict. And it's the same before the conflict or before a disaster. So firstly, you've got to understand your legal responsibilities and obligations. You must develop partnerships and trust, critical, and I'll come to that later in the presentation, before a conflict or a disaster. Trying to do it later is enormously reduces the effectiveness. And a critical element of all of this is the indivisible nature of protecting people and protecting their heritage. The two are indivisibly intertwined. And here's the slide that isn't very nice. So culture and heritage give people a sense of place, of identity, belonging, dignity, contributing overall to their well-being. But, and as I just stressed, you can't differentiate the two. And the image in the slide here from the village of Brocko in former Yugoslavia underlines that better than 1,000 textbooks. You have a trench dug about 2 miles away from the village, and into which the villagers of Brocko were machine gunned. But the trench was not filled up by the earth that came out of the trench to make the trench. It was filled up, as you can see in the image here, by the rubble of their mosque. Their mosque completely destroyed, taken down to what an archaeologist would say was natural. So there is no chance of an archaeological excavation where that mosque once stood in 5 months, in 5 years, in 500 years, identifying the ground plan of a mosque. There is nothing left of that mosque. It is all buried with the population of the village who used to worship in the mosque. So there you have the cultural heritage, the cultural property, and the people buried in the same grave that was supposed to be there and lost forever and never seen again. The two things are indivisible, and there are other examples. You will have seen some of the appalling treatment of the Yazidi by the so-called Islamic State a few years ago. And probably the most well-documented and recent issue is the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar in refugee camps on the borders now. When the International Organization of Migrations asked them about their mental health and their mental well-being, 73% of the Rohingya who were surveyed said the biggest problem about mental health and mental well-being was the loss of their cultural heritage, their loss of their places of culture, but also many of the traditions. And so the IOM have now started building cultural centers in some of those refugee camps, trying to help people come to terms with their refugee status and their move, but their loss, and trying to regain that cultural heritage. So absolutely critical. But let me take you back. We said that the First World War was traumatic, and it obviously was. And there was a huge amount of cultural property lost and damaged during the war. However, there was some excellent cultural property protection planning done and delivery. So in 1917, when the British occupied or liberated or conquered Jerusalem, whichever word you want to use, a proclamation was sent out by Field Marshal Allenby, the commander of the British troops there, which had actually been written weeks before by the civil service for him in London. And the key element of the proclamation was that every sacred building, monument, holy spot, shrine of the three religions will be maintained and protected by Allenby's troops. And that was a really good bit of cultural property protection. Somebody on Allenby's staff turned it into a piece of brilliant CPP, because the predominantly Islamic population of Jerusalem in 1917 were very worried that the Christians were back and that was going to be another crusade and work and putting down Islamic traditions and religion. So there was a boiling up of unquiet amongst the Islamic population. The brilliant piece was that the staffer who did this deployed Muslim Indian troops under Allenby's command to protect the mosques. It wasn't a difficult decision, but it was a brilliant decision, because by that one act, it disarmed the Islamic population, and there was no opposition to the British military rule in Jerusalem while those Indian troops protected the Islamic sites. A piece of planning or failure to plan comes much later, and to juxtapose the two. So in 2002, the Americans created 6 so-called think tanks in Washington to plan for post-Saddam Iraq. And one of those had a subcommittee on culture, the whole of culture. That subcommittee never met. As a result, the National Museum in Baghdad, every regional museum, the National Library, the National Archive, most university libraries and archives around the country, and many other heritage places were looted. And here you've just got one of the basement rooms in the National Museum, and they all look like this or worse. Well, I was asked in 2003 to help with the protection of the archaeological heritage in Iraq. I said, but surely the International Committee of the Red Cross will be involved in that. And their response was, no, we only deal with people. Disagreeing with my premise earlier that the two are completely indivisibly intertwined. We don't want to look after their heritage because it diminishes our role looking after the people. So you had the failure to protect at the beginning of the conflict, but that failure carried on through, and in 2006, most commentators see the destruction of the Al-Aqshari Mosque in Samarra as the tipping point from a Iraqi population increasingly fed up with the presence of the coalition troops in Iraq, into the full-scale sectarian civil war, which, according to Western thinking and policy, required the coalition troops to stay for a further 5 years. And they took 5 years worth more of casualties and 5 years worth of fatalities. And if those two weren't bad enough, probably the biggest problem in those additional 5 years was that the coalition completely and utterly lost the media and propaganda war. And so that gave the ability for the re-emergence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it provided the oxygen for the rise of the so-called Islamic State. And that failure to plan for protecting culture was not by any means the only issue and contributing factor, but it was a significant one in those failures. So the Blue Shield, envisaged in 1954, but only created in 1996, arrives 42 years late. It comprises the founding 4 heritage organizations, the international organizations for museums, for monuments and sites, for libraries, and for archives. It has, at the moment, 30 national committees with a further 15 under preparation. And together, the founding 4 and those national committees elect an international board of 4 people, plus 4 representatives of the heritage organizations and a president. And they also, together with the secretariat of the Blue Shield, which I'll come to in a moment, together the board and the secretariat are called Blue Shield International, or BSI, named after the emblem, whereas in 1954 they thought they were going to call the organization the Blue and White Shield. For obvious reasons, it is now only referred to as the Blue Shield. The mission of the Blue Shield is there on the screen: committed to the protection of the world's cultural property, reflecting the 1954 convention, which is still the primary piece of international humanitarian law, and is concerned with the protection, bringing it more linguistically up to date, of cultural and natural heritage, because the distinction between those is a real Western concept. Most other people around the globe refuse to understand or simply reject the separation of those. It's about not only tangible heritage, the places, the objects, it's also about the intangible. Some of the things that the Rohingya want in their refugee camps is the continuation of the stories and their songs. And it's to do with, in the event of armed conflict, as related to the 54 Convention, but also more broadly, because the training is essentially the same for first responders, natural or human-made disasters as well. And in the image, you see members of the Argentinian National Committee of the Blue Shield at the end of the filming of a 6-part documentary on protection of cultural property that they convinced the Argentinian TV company to produce. Our end goal is the creation or the maintenance or the contribution to healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities, because that's what we're all trying to do. And with our aspect of this, bringing culture in to do that, going right back to the creation of UNESCO and the UN in 1945. And Newcastle's role in this has been absolutely fundamental. So in 2015, I had a discussion with the then Vice-Chancellor about the university applying to UNESCO to create a UNESCO Chair in Cultural Property Protection and Peace. And the VC at that point said, absolutely, this is what universities are supposed to be involved in. It is our moral obligation. And since then, we applied to UNESCO. Unfortunately, the idea of UNESCO Chair is not that UNESCO give the university a lot of money, but the university gives UNESCO the money by paying for the staff of the chair. So the university has funded my post since the 1st of January 2016, and since July 2017, 1.5 other posts. And those 1.5 others have become the Secretariat for the Blue Shield. And the university is now the largest funder of the Blue Shield in the world. That cannot continue forever, and we are planning a major fundraising campaign to start next year. But the contribution that your university has made to this, for the alumni listening, has been staggering and wonderful. And I thank the university. So the context for the Blue Shield is, the primary context is the 1954 Hague Convention and its protocols, underpinned by wider international law and the UN and UNESCO's strategic agendas, conscious of the Sustainable Development Goals and, for example, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And we see cultural property protection as a multi-sector responsibility and opportunity. And that's a key part of the discussion. I'll come to that in a moment. And in the image, you see now my ex-retired colleague, Paul Fox, working with colleagues from NATO on a NATO exercise, tabletop exercise in this instance, back in 2018. I said earlier that we have to have partnerships. It has to be a multi-sector responsibility, and we have to work with the uniform sector, the humanitarian sector, and of course, the heritage sector. We have to understand the political, legal, and media environments of which all of that takes place. And to help us do that, we have started developing formal relations. For example, moving away from their stance in 2003, the International Committee of the Red Cross, with NATO, with the UN peacekeeping force in Lebanon. The image is training Irish Defence Force troops who only deploy as UN peacekeepers, and with the Smithsonian and the Cultural Emergency Response in the Netherlands, and one under process with UNESCO. And we envisage that as a triangle set within a circle. So the triangle, as with all good self-respecting triangles, has 3 points: the heritage sector, the humanitarian sector, and the uniform sector. And by that, we mean not only the armed forces, but borders, customs, the police, emergency services. And as put to me by a colonel in the US military last year, "Oh, I get it, sir. The space in between is where the Blue Shield works and where there are no stupid questions." And that was absolutely spot on, because those 3 sectors all have completely different starting points. They have completely different agendas to get to the end result, which in, as I say, Blue Shield language, is the creation or maintenance of those healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities. But that triangle of sort of professional work and sharing and understanding is set within the much broader context of the political situation, the legal responsibilities, and the media, which, as I say, is becoming increasingly important. But why do we do all of this down at the bottom? for communities. And so that's how we envisage the whole package. A key element of this is that BSI, Blue Shield International, is an independent, impartial and neutral organisation. We will not and do not point the finger of blame at anybody involved in a conflict situation. So, for example, with Ukraine, we have not blamed any party to that conflict, but we work with all of them to try and protect cultural property under their responsibilities under international humanitarian law and other international law. And that approach allows us to work behind the scenes with everybody, not alienating one by us saying, you caused this. So that works, and we follow there the ideals and the working methodology of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and we are absolutely intending to fulfill the original aspiration in 1954 to become their cultural equivalent. It isn't going to happen in my lifetime, but if we don't put the foundation stones in place, it won't happen in my grandchildren's lifetime. However, we understand that national committees may find it by their very nature less easy to comply with that independent, impartial and neutral stance. And so we give them slightly greater freedom to take a public stance. But that's the critical way that we work. So we have something called the Blue Shield approach, which we've been developing since 2012. It's why we do things and how we do things. And it's intended to provide a national flexibility within a common framework. And again, you've got in the image one of my colleagues, Emma Cunliffe, working with staff from a NATO HQ on a particular tabletop exercise where we put into NATO's military planning and exercising issues relating to cultural property that they have to deal with, both under their responsibilities, but also seeing those as opportunities for better deployment and better use of their work. So the approach has 7 elements, and I'm not going to go through all of these in any detail. We have 5 issues, the 5 most common asked questions in many ways. So do you protect people or do you protect their old things? People first always, but the two things are completely indivisible. Do we talk about cultural property or cultural heritage? It really doesn't matter. It's the same sort of stuff. So that's the 5 issues. The 2000 Strasbourg Charter gives us that independence, impartiality and neutrality. You've seen our mission statement. The 4-tier approach is identifying the 4 times that cultural property or cultural property experts need to work with those other sectors. And we do that with long-term education, immediate before deployment or following a disaster, needing to know the detail and training about the detail about the heritage in country A, then during the conflict and post-conflict. We have 6 areas of activity that we ask BSI and all national committees to plan to and report on. And those 6 areas are things like proactive protection, coordination, legal aspects, but the national committees can prioritize them in any order that they want, and they may not do more than 1 or 2 of the activities in any given year. But the idea of planning to those areas and reporting on them gives a coherence to the organization that really wasn't there before 2012. When I first got involved in this, everybody used to tell me, Pete, get real, things get destroyed in conflict. It's called collateral damage. Yes, that's absolutely true. But there are 7 other threats to cultural property, the biggest ones being lack of awareness and lack of planning, that if you address those 8 threats, you significantly reduce the threat to cultural property during conflict or following disaster. And then there are 7 reasons why CPP is important for the other 2 sectors. So, for example, for the uniform sector, the UN see this as a security issue. They see the trade in illicit antiquities funding the continuation of conflict. So the military, for example, have to be aware of the UN steer on this, and there are 6 other ones that go into that. So that's an overall view of those 7 elements of the approach. Some of the stuff that we're doing at the moment, we're trying to raise awareness, not only with lectures like this, but with our national committees. We're building the capacity of the national committees with online virtual training for them. We're working closely with NATO on a template for cultural property protection on their so-called no strike lists, to develop exercise input. You've seen some of that. This is Paul Fox's replacement, Michael de la Cruz. Both Paul and Michael were in their respective armed forces lieutenant colonels. They both have PhDs in art history, so they understand the language of both sides in many ways much better than I do, and they can go into a situation as an expert on both sides of the discussion. And we're developing policy with NATO, and I'll come back to those in a moment. I'm working with other multinational and national groups. So Michael there is working on identifying cultural sites in Honduras with a multinational military audience and heritage audience. We're doing a lot of work with UN peacekeeping and other peacekeeping missions. And that's me on a training course run by the UN Training School in Ireland for, I think there were 7 or 8 national militaries involved in that training, who will all be deploying and by now will have deployed as UN peacekeepers. We're working with Eastern European countries who are at the moment considerably more worried than they were on the 23rd of February of this year. We are, because we work behind the scenes, supporting the protection of cultural workers and cultural property in Afghanistan, and we're searching for that long-term funding for a central team of 12. So how are we doing? Just a couple of examples. In 2011, the NATO air campaign in Libya, the responsibility for creating a list of sites that a country would prefer not to be damaged in conflict is supposed to be with the country. Libya couldn't do that, hadn't done that. So together, the US and the UK national committees produced a list of CP that we gave to NATO, and NATO, a targeteer sitting on an airfield in the Netherlands, identified 6 vehicles of a mobile radar and communications unit parked up just outside and inside a large derelict building, and identified that from satellite imagery. That targeteer identified 1 large bomb to be dropped on that site, the derelict building, to destroy all 6 of those vehicles. I don't know the detail of what happened next, but the equivalent of a red light flashed on his or her computer, as they were the same coordinates for a Roman building that we had asked to be protected if at all possible. The decision went up the military food chain, and it was then decided to, in military speak, modify the ordnance. They changed the weapon, and they used 6 precision weapons to destroy each of the 6 vehicles, and they all look like that one in the front, and you can see the Roman building almost fully intact behind. That got considerable positive media coverage for NATO, so much so they were so unused to that sort of stuff that a NATO review internally was set up to find out what they'd done well. That recommended that NATO should develop a NATO-wide CPP policy. That hasn't happened yet, but there was a first step in 2018 with something called a directive, which was set up. And we are working with NATO over this winter to actually draft the policy that we hope will go into practice next year or possibly the year after. So that's a considerable impact. You heard the difference between 2003, when the ICRC didn't want anything to do with cultural property protection, to 2020, when Yves Dacour, the then Director General, argued, as you can see on the screen, protecting cultural property and cultural heritage against the devastating effects of war unfortunately remains a humanitarian imperative today, perhaps more than ever. So the ICRC and an MOU with them. And then finally, just to talk very briefly about Beirut. We had been working with the UN peacekeeping deployment in Lebanon, the Lebanese Armed Forces, the Department of Antiquities, Blue Shield Lebanon, and an NGO in Lebanon called Biladi since 2013. That had built partnership and trust over the 7 years before the 4th of August explosion. About 4 hours after the explosion, I was talking on the phone to colleagues from Blue Shield Lebanon and Biladi. The next day, they agreed that they would work on the private museums, archives, libraries, some of the religious buildings, whereas the DGA would look after the state-funded ones. And between all of those bodies on the ground, they produced a photographic report of the damage to these sites by the Sunday, so 5 days later. At the same time as they were doing that photographic record, I'd been working with international heritage organizations, with the head of Biladi, and with the photographic report in hand. A week later, we got a few thousand shy of 100,000 euros for securing those non-government buildings, boarding up the windows, replacing all of the doors, all of which had been lost, fixing broken pipes, putting some tiles back on roofs, etc. But then something that would never have happened had we not been working with UNIFIL and LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, for 7 years happened. UNIFIL got permission to move out of their area of responsibility in the south and to come and help predominantly at the port. But because they got permission, they phoned up Blue Shield in Lebanon and Biladi and said, we're coming to Beirut. We know there must have been lots of heritage damaged. What can we do to help? And so with a four-way role with Biladi, Blue Shield Lebanon, UNIFIL, LAF, and the DGA, we stabilized 2 major historic buildings. And in the image, you see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs building, and that had lost 3/4 of its roof. The white is a replacement temporary roof being put on by Lebanese Armed Forces, and the structural engineers from LAF and from UNIFIL work together, because the weight of the roof of these buildings is the thing that keeps the building together. And because 3/4 of that roof had been lost, the walls of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were going out at the rate of about 20 centimeters a week. So the first thing that the UNIFIL and LAF had to do under Blue Shield architects was to pull them back together, put a temporary roof on, and that has worked and is supposed to be there for 5 years. I would guess it may well be there for 25 years, but we'll see, and we hope that they find the money to actually reconstitute that building properly. There is still an enormous way to go. Most of the work in Lebanon was done from a heritage point of view by volunteer students, many of whom, or a number of whom, you can see in the image. We have to do it now. We have to develop if we are going to become that cultural equivalent of the Red Cross and actually help those like the Rohingya actually be better because we are protecting not only them, but their heritage as well. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you so much for that presentation. It was so insightful and interesting and really positive to hear about all of the great work happening within this area, but also how Newcastle University as an institution has supported the efforts of Blue Shield over the past years. It's really, really interesting to hear. I personally have loads of questions that I'd like to ask, as I'm sure everyone else does on the call today. I know there's been a few questions pop up in the Q&A, but I'd just like to welcome all of our attendees to take this time to submit some questions via the Q&A function or via the chat. But to give you time to do that, we're going to go through some questions that have been pre-submitted, if that's okay with you, Peter. So first of all, I'd like to ask a question. I know we have a lot of heritage professionals attending the call today. So a question around how can a heritage professional contribute in the initiatives of the Blue Shield?
Okay, thank you. I mean, one of the key things is if to join their national committee of the Blue Shield, if one exists, and there is one in the UK, or if there isn't a national committee of the Blue Shield, then contact BSI. The website link is there on the last of the images, and start thinking about setting one up yourself.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And kind of on a similar note, how can we be better, just as individuals, be better heritage allies to local communities across the world? Similar thing, or is there anything additional we can do as individuals?
It's a similar thing. It's a similar thing. It is raising the awareness of the importance of heritage. So not only with a Rohingya, a brilliant case study of that, the Yazidi, Brocco, but there is lots of now medical research going on that says people who live in a landscape, a sort of urban or rural landscape where there is lots of heritage buildings and a sort of a depth to that, have a better well-being score than those who live in completely modern environments. And so we need to think about that in terms of planning. We need to think about that in terms of, do we keep that old building and can we reuse it, or should we knock it down and put a tall building there? So, yeah.
Absolutely, great advice. Thank you so much. Another question that's been pre-submitted before the event today asks, what are the biggest challenges in protecting cultural heritage in conflict areas in practice?
Well, the first is that it's a conflict area, and conflict areas are sort of by definition areas that one would prefer not to be in or go to, if at all possible. And in many ways, that's why we put the emphasis on preparation in peacetime, so that the communities, the different communities within the country that's in conflict, can deploy that training and those preparations themselves before you get into having to take in external people to help, because the complications of getting somebody into a conflict area are massive, not least just a minor point of insurance, but so huge difficulties there. So if there is one thing about cultural property protection, it has to be a peacetime activity, because you have to be ready and prepared before going into the conflict zone. But that doesn't mean that people don't go into the conflict zone. And over the weekend, I was with 3 colleagues from the Ukraine and working out how we can help them more and how we can identify if there has been any deliberate targeting of cultural heritage in that particular conflict, or if it is just essentially the collateral damage issue.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We've had a couple of questions come in through the Q&A function, and I'm going to take two of the questions because they're quite similar, one from Jeremy and one from Paul. So thank you for submitting your questions. And they kind of talk about, do you ever get any countries or groups who have rejected or pushed back against the work of Blue Shield? And if so, how have you overcame this as a challenge?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose there are groups, and at the moment, although this hasn't always been the case, many of those are, sort of extremist groups like so-called Islamic State, like Ansandine in Timbuktu, etc., who see it as a religious duty to attack some elements of cultural property. The Taliban in Afghanistan also took that view when they were in control the last time in the beginning of, or the end of the 90s, early 2000s. Interesting, the Taliban have to some extent changed their approach, and they've changed their approach to some extent because of the arguments made by organizations like the Blue Shield. I'm aware that there have been recently Taliban groups going to parts of Afghanistan where there are Buddhist shrines and Buddhist archaeological sites and the such, wanting to know about them, wanting to be taught about them, which would never have happened before. You can't get away from the fact that there are going to be some people who are just going to try and go out and destroy stuff. And so you have Ansandine, for example, in Timbuktu, who were destroying mausolea and mosques in Timbuktu, and also, mausolea, so cemeteries where there was anything above ground to show, because in their interpretation of Islam, that is idolatrous and shouldn't be the case. So there's very little you could do about that during the conflict. But what happened in Timbuktu is that we were able to take, not Blue Shield, but the international community through the International Criminal Court, were able to take a gentleman called Mr. Al-Mahdi in front of the International Criminal Court, prosecute him and convict him for the destruction of 9 mausolea and a mosque in Timbuktu. So there is a message that goes out with that even if you can't stop it during conflict, just as with the Nuremberg trials, people will be caught up with afterwards. Interestingly, there are many more armed non-state actors, as the terminology goes, so non-state armed forces, who are really keen to try and protect heritage, because that's one of the reasons they're fighting. And that becomes quite difficult because you have, in some instances, sanctions which prohibit organizations like the Blue Shield training those people from those non-state actors organizations from their responsibilities, obligations about protecting cultural property. So yeah, if it's not a naff analogy, it's a lot of a minefield of trying to get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question we've had in through the Q&A from Evelyn Ashmore has asked, obviously we've spoken a lot about conflict that's happened overseas. So how much CPP has been done to protect our heritage here in the UK? And do you think it needs to be prioritised more, or do we think it's already taken seriously enough in the UK?
Yeah, so the UK in 2003, along with America, had not ratified the 1954 Hague Convention. The Americans got round to ratifying the convention, but neither of the protocols in 2009. The UK only got around to ratifying all 3 parts of the convention in 2017. And the Blue Shield UK National Committee that I used to chair has produced a couple of documents criticising the UK government for failing to implement the convention properly. So yes, there is a lot of heritage protection that goes on in the UK, but there is a complete change of level if you're trying to protect something during an armed conflict. And it is, as with the quote from our colleague in Ukraine at the beginning of this presentation, if you don't prepare for the worst, you're not ready for the worst. And if you're not ready for the worst, then cultural property will be damaged, will be destroyed, will be looted, will be lost.
Absolutely.
So there are perhaps 2 countries in the world that have done a lot of good implementation. The rest are lagging behind significantly.
Fascinating. So we've got 2 more questions that I want to run through, and I think we've got time for the final 2, and then we'll have to wrap up for the day. Any other questions that come in, we can, if you're happy, Peter, to answer them, and we can circulate the answers after the session. Would that be okay with you? Yep. So a question from Philippa in the chat is around kind of neutrality. And she's asked, surely BSI can't support parties that are actively abusing humanitarian law. So there must be boundaries that exist to the concept of neutrality.
That's Philippa, you put your finger right on the most difficult element perhaps of what we do. But as with the ICRC, we will talk to anybody if they will talk to us. What we don't do is talk to them about the wider conflict. We talk about them very specifically about the protection of cultural property. And just as the ICRC will talk and do talk to anybody, but in the specifics of protecting people under the Geneva Conventions, etc., we have the responsibility of doing that with in relation to the 54 Hague Convention. So it's very difficult, and you sit in some discussions questioning why you might be in the room, but it is because that's the job. And it's difficult, but at the moment that's how we take it.
Excellent. And our final question today comes from Edwin, who's joined us all the way from the Netherlands. And
hello, Edwin. I think I know who you might be.
Yeah, and Edwin's asked, he says, hi, Peter, just to let you know. Are there any directions for the army to get more understanding for CPP or heritage protection? And when can we expect a new doctrine from NATO on this?
Well, we hope that the doctrine from NATO, which come out in the form of what NATO call a policy, will go to the Joint Committee in NATO next year. So that's the Joint Military Civilian Committee. That's my aspiration. It's not necessary, and I think it's a NATO aspired timetable as well. So okay. Edwin II. Okay, so I think that's there. Edwin II will also know that the Dutch military have a cultural property protection unit in place that tries to work with the rest of the Dutch armed forces to put CPP into their consciousness. At the same time that the UK was finally implementing and ratifying, the 54 Convention, they also created, for the first time since the Second World War, a cultural property protection unit, joint service unit of 18 officers who are there again, raising the profile of CPP across the British Armed Forces and elsewhere. So there are places. The Americans have just set up a new process. The Cambodians have a CPP unit. They're all over the place. The French are developing a CPP capability in their armed forces. So there are lots there is a lot going on, and increasingly it is becoming not yet the norm, but it's becoming increasingly frequent that armed forces involved in conflict do have specialist units or specialist capabilities for doing this sort of work.
Thank you so much, Peter. So unfortunately, that is all we've got time for today. Thank you for everyone who submitted questions either before the session or during the chat or Q&A function today. What we would like to say is just a massive thank you to Peter for delivering the session today. It's been a really insightful discussion. I'm sure everyone on the call has taken a lot away from it today. For everyone who's attended, also thank you for being with us. We really hope that you've enjoyed today's session. We'd also like to take this opportunity to remind you that this is the last Discover event of 2022, but we will be back in the new year with lots more interesting topics, first of which will be in January, where we'll be joined by Lydia McClaskey, who's the head of wills, trusts and probate at Minkoff Solicitors, who'll be providing an insight into preparing a will. So if that's something you're interested in, look out for the invites for that. As well, for any alumni that we've got on the call, we'd like to take this opportunity to remind you of our annual meeting of convocation on Saturday the 26th of November. Please get in touch with us if you want to find out more, or visit our website to find the full details about the event and also how to sign up. Again, we'd just like to finish by saying a final thank you to Peter and also everyone else who joined the call today. We hope you have a great rest of the week, and we hope to see you at another event soon.